Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with another deck overview, this time with Temur Scapeshift in the modern format. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these quick deck overviews, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, letting me know what deck you might like to see us cover next. So Temur Scapeshift, basically the smart man's green-red Scapeshift, is a combo deck in the modern format that plays out very similarly to what green-red Scapeshift does, but you add a little bit of blue interaction to your spells. For baseline, regular Scapeshift is straight green-red. You have access to obviously Secure Tribe Elder, Explore, Dryad of Elysian Groves, and Search for Tomorrow as ramp spells. You play some number of Primeval Titans and some number of Scapeshifts to win the game. You do this via Valakut, the Molten Pinnacle, and a bunch of mountains, damning your opponent to death. Obviously, Dryad makes this a little bit easier, and these decks often play a Wish package to have additional copies of Scapeshift in the sideboard. A lot of these versions have also been playing the Jund Splash for Soul of Windgrace, but the one we are focusing on today is a little bit more of a tempo-ish deck. This deck has largely existed since the unbanning of Valakut, the Molten Pinnacle, and often revolves around playing cards to slow your opponent down rather than just being a straight-up ramp deck. So to that end, you're playing things like Remand and Fire Ice to slow your opponent down, in addition to the bolts that the normal red-green Scapeshift deck plays. You also have a little bit more card selection with things like Expressive Iteration, Growth Spiral, allowing you to draw a card and put a land into play, and you're still ramping with things like Dryad of Elysian Groves, and you're just trying to hit Scapeshift. You're not playing things like Primeval Titan, so you were very dependent upon drawing Scapeshift, hence why a card like Expressive Iteration is so important. Land base, most of it centers around being mountain heavy. Obviously, you're playing some number of Valakuts, usually 3 to 4. You play as many mountains as you can pack into a deck, so you have 7 here, you have access to 8, 9, 10, and then you have 11 a basic mountain. You sometimes do have to keep track of how many mountains you have in your deck. This is a little bit more prevalent for the Bring to Light version, which we're not covering in this video, as that's kind of a separate deck because it's a little bit more of a toolboxy kind of thing and plays Omnath and Valky and all these other different things, whereas this deck is still a little bit more akin to its green-red cousin, being very combo-oriented, but also being a little bit more tempo in terms of answering your opponent's early things. You know, remanding him here, bolting them there, tapping a land down, slowing them down, in addition to ramping up. So you're a little bit less vulnerable to combo-esque decks or control-esque decks, or actually just more combo-esque decks, or decks just trying to run you down, because you have a little bit more interaction. You're not dependent on going, we're going to ramp spell, payoff. You're more like remand, ramp spell, bolt something, Dryad, land, Scapeshift you. You know, you have a little bit more options in what you're doing. Obviously in the sideboard, you have access to various different things to fight through. Chalice of the Void, very good against a lot of the combo decks, especially the various Cascade decks. Also good against decks like Burn and such. You can struggle against as they are a little bit faster than you. Engineer Explosives as nice catch-all sweepers against the low-to-the-ground aggressive decks, or just early problematic things. You know, can even answer things like Blood Moon, Damping Sphere, although I guess Damping Sphere isn't really such a thing for this deck. But things like Blood Moon can answer things like Death Shadow, Tarmogoyfs, you know, can answer a bunch of 1-drops out of something like, is it Murktide or Burn? So, nice kind of catch-all. Force of Vigor here, primarily here for the main hate card against you, and that is Blood Moon, but also things like Alpine Moon can slow you down, cause you problems. Endurance, primarily here for any type of graveyard nonsense, very good against decks like Murktide, against decks like Living End and such, which could otherwise be a bit problematic, hence why you're seeing things like Chalice of the Void. Veil of Summer to allow your spells to resolve, also can protect you against discard spells, although it's a little bit less prevalent these days. Flusterstorm, once again, ways to force your spells through or to keep your opponent's key spells from resolving. Mainly here against the various blue soup piles, along with the Veils of Summer. And then Besage, just giving you another land drop that you have access to that also happens to answer the main hate card that you deal with, and that being Blood Moon. This deck is a little less vulnerable to something like Magus, as you are playing 3 to 4 copies of Bolt, 3 to 4 copies of Fire Ice, so you don't necessarily care as much about Magus, but you definitely do care if Blood Moon resolves, as it kind of shuts down your primary game plan. Alright, this version's a little bit different, choosing to be a little bit more on the ramp plan and a little bit less on the tempo plan. To that end, in addition to the 4 growth spirals, they are playing 2 copies of Explore to pair with your Dryads as ramp spells. You're still playing the 4-play set of Expressive Iteration, still with the bolts, 1 less Fire Ice, You're still playing the 4 Romance. They're choosing to play Dress Down as an interactive spell against a lot of different decks. Makes the elementals a little bit worse, although your deck doesn't have a ton of stuff to target other than maybe the dryads, so furies and stuff aren't nearly as good against you, but can be very good in a lot of situations, especially against Urza Saga tokens and such, and it cantrips, so worst case scenario, it's a 2-mana cantrip that maybe can slow down your opponent's strategy just a little bit. Obviously, still playing the 4 copies of Scapeshift, you're still trying to Scapeshift your opponent into oblivion. As far as the land base, we've already kind of covered the mountain part of things, but you do play some number of non-mountain basics to be able to play around Blood Moon, primarily a couple forests and an island, just to be able to cast your spells if your opponent happens to resolve a Blood Moon. Sideboard plan for this deck, a lot very similar things. We're not seeing Flusterstorms, but we're seeing even more copies of Force of Vigor, so obviously they're respecting things like Blood Moon a little bit more. Second copy of Beseiju still, so you still have 5 outs to things like Blood Moon, and if it gets past your counter spells. A couple copies of Fury helps to slow down the faster aggro decks, in addition to having, you know, a secondary threat in the mid game if your opponent's dealing with your threats otherwise. Still gives you a nice out to kill something like Magus, can come down against, you know, something like Hammer Time, maybe kill a Mem Knight and a Pure Steel Paladin before they can get a hammer on it, etc. Quite a nice card to have access to, and obviously Force of Vigor plays nicely into any type of Urza Saga nonsense, in addition to being a good fighting tool against Blood Moon, which is the primary hate card against you. Finally, take a look at this one. Very similar to the first one we saw. In fact, I think it's almost identical in the main deck. You're seeing some number of Spell Pierces in addition to Remands as a little bit of counterplay against what your opponent's doing. Obviously, Spell Pierce can help force through a Scapeshift if your opponent, say, only left up a counter spell or something. Sideboard, you know, you're seeing a lot of the same tools, but the main reason I wanted to bring this one to the fore was a couple copies of Aether Gust. Strongly deals with Blood Moon, helps deal with Primeval Titan out of something like Amulet, at least for a turn. Helps you fight through any type of, you know, like I said, Blood Moon effects. Can help slow down something like Burn, which can be a very problematic matchup otherwise because you're not playing at things like Omnath to recoup some life loss. So you kind of get the general gist of what the cards that you're seeing out of these decks are. Obviously, this deck is very similar to Green-Red Scapeshift in terms of, you know, plays a very narrow set of cards. It's trying to execute the same strategy every game. It's just a little bit different in what it's trying to do. You know, in the early terms, it might play a little bit more of a tempo game with holding up Growth Spirals and Romance to slow down your opponent. But in the end, it's just a slightly smarter player's version of Valakut, and often just gets to kill your opponent on turn 5. If that kind of gameplay appeals to you, obviously this deck can be very good. Where this deck tends to struggle into faster aggressive decks, especially decks like Burn that don't always care about, you know, its bolts and its fire ices. Can also struggle a little bit into a deck playing a bunch of counter spells, hence why you see things like Veil of Summer and Flusterstorm. And the other cards you have to fight through are hate cards like Alpine Moon, Blood Moon, those kind of effects. Also, the rare instances you might see, what is the 3-mana enchantment that goes with Lotus Field sometimes. But basically, not Blood Moon, I can see the card, Blood Sun is the other card that keeps you from searching the library for your lands from doing the Valakut thing. So, you know, having access to things that answer land hate, which are mostly in the form of enchantments or artifacts. Obviously, Damping Sphere doesn't really particularly affect you because you don't tap for multiple color, or you don't tap for a bunch of colorless mana or anything. But, you know, Alpine Moon, Blood Moon, the Blood Sun, all do see some play with Blood Moon. Obviously, Blood Moon / Magus the Moon being the primary one that you see. Obviously, having access to bolts and fire ices, you're a little less vulnerable to Magus, but you are a little bit vulnerable to Blood Moon, especially game 1 when you only have access to Beseiju. Obviously, Dryad can come down over at Blood Moon in terms of being able to cast your spells, but it doesn't keep you from your Valakuts triggering, etc. So it is very important to understand that Blood Moon is one of the best cards against you. You are a little bit soft to fast aggro or tempo decks like Izzet Murktide. You do play quite nicely into the various you know, blue soup decks. Also, while having things like Dryad, Spell Pierce, Flusterstorm, you can play quite nicely against the various Cascade decks. So overall, this is a deck that tends to struggle on the margins, tends to struggle against hard control, tends to struggle against, you know, Murktide and Burn. Also, if your spells don't line up quite well, like if your opponent's playing a bunch of big dumb idiots, so potentially a deck like Zoo can give you a little bit of problems because your removal spells aren't really removal spells, so that becomes a race rather than you being able to interact with them terribly much. Now, obviously, between Fire Ice, your ramp spells, Remand here, Remand there, you can kind of face those matchups, but In the past, I know when I've played decks like Is It Through the Breach, it had Emrakul and stuff, you know, when you play these kind of combo blue-esque decks, you can sometimes struggle against decks that play bigger creatures, hence why you see things like, you know, some of these decks would splash for like Fatal Push or Path to Exile, or, you know, you play things like Ether Gust to be able to deal with a big Tarmogoyf or something. Otherwise, you're just kind of hoping to race your opponent and tempo them out just a little bit. Like I said, this is kind of the smart player's version of Scapeshift, and you have the real extreme, which is the BTL Scapeshift lists, but, you know, those are kind of a toolbox deck that also happens to have Scapeshift in them, but we might cover those in a separate video. But this is Temur Scapeshift deck overview for the modern format. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know what deck you might like to see us cover next.